All right, it is 10 a.m. I'd like to welcome you all to Virtual Coffee Club. This is our last one. My name is Alexis, and I'm the Programs and Volunteer Coordinator at the Western Development Museum in Moose Jaw. And I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgement is important because it recognizes the treaty that we're living on, and a treaty is an agreement between two groups of people on how they're going to live on that land together. So I'd like to start by saying I'm a fourth-generation European settler with distant Métis ancestry, and I'm humbled by the opportunity to live, work, and grow as a person on Treaty 4 territory, the homeland of the Métis. And as a programs and volunteer coordinator here at the Western Development Museum, we're working on rebuilding our relationship with Indigenous people through reconciliation initiatives. So our guest speaker today is a Regina-based award-winning automotive journalist and author. He's been a regular columnist for Old Autos since 1997, and he's reported on the displays at the Western Development Museums in Moose Jaw and Saskatoon over the years. He's written for the Leader Post, Toronto Star, Collectible Automobile, Old Cars Weekly, and many other publications. His book, The Last Best Car, the 67X, tells the story of 4 rare Canadian cars created by George Barris and given out at Esso gas stations as prizes in 1967. Dale did a presentation at the Western Development Museum a few years ago, and his book is available here at the gift shop in the museum. We also are going to give away one of his books for, we'll do a draw of the people that attended, and it is a signed copy as well. He will be leading a walking tour through Heritage Regina of former car dealerships in downtown Regina on Wednesday, July 10th, starting at 6 p.m. at Albert Street and Victoria Avenue. So that's 2 weeks from tonight if you want to join him. Today, he's here to tell us about an interesting and little-known chapter in Saskatchewan's automotive history, the General Motor plant in Regina. So please welcome from Regina, Dale Edward Johnson. I think you're muted there, Dale.
There, how's that?
Perfect.
All right, thanks, Alexis. Well, today I want to share the story of why General Motors decided to build an assembly plant in Regina almost 100 years ago. It had a huge impact on the community. It was the largest physical building in the city. It was also the largest employer in the city. I want to tell you about the GM plant through the eyes of one of the people who worked there, Jimmy Dillon. In my research, I spoke with Jimmy Dillon's son and his granddaughter. They've shared family stories and pictures for this documentary you're about to see. Now, this Zoom presentation contains sections from a live stage presentation that I wrote and produced for Heritage Regina. Now, I'd like to play part of that presentation, so please join me. Let's travel back in time 100 years.
After the Great War, a pandemic, and a depression in the late teens, things changed dramatically during the 1920s. Canada was booming. There were jobs. There was money. There were new technologies, including home appliances, radios, and the movies. Women's roles were changing. Women in the 20s were more likely to drink, smoke, vote, and work outside the home compared with their mothers. Cities were growing dramatically as people were leaving farms. Travel and tourism took off thanks to the automobile and the airplane. General Motors of Canada expanded its Oshawa plant in 1926. GM had 5,000 employees by 1928 and was turning out a new car every minute. That's when GM opened a new plant in Walkerville, now part of Windsor, Ontario. Still, GM couldn't keep up with the demand for new cars. Another factory was needed, and GM looked to Western Canada. Saskatchewan was a very different place in the 1920s than it is now. Back then, only Quebec and Ontario had more people than Saskatchewan. The capital city of this booming province was Regina. With 40,000 people, Regina was the largest city in the province. It was already home to the RCMP, Regina College, and the provincial legislature. Regina was the distribution and manufacturing center for the province. And cars? Well, as the 1920s opened, there were more than 60,000 vehicles in Saskatchewan. That total was second in the country, behind only Ontario. And Ontario had 4 times more people than Saskatchewan. Canada's very first licensed air harbor, or airport as we now call them, opened in Regina in the 1920s. By 1925, Saskatchewan had the second highest ownership rate, with 8.5 vehicles for every 100 people, behind only Ontario. With the booming economy, sales of cars increased dramatically during the 1920s. More dealers were needed to sell these vehicles. More than half the cars on Saskatchewan's roads were Ford Model Ts. But people who went car shopping in Regina in the 1920s didn't have to settle for a Model T. They had lots of other choices, including Plymouths, Dodges, DeSotos, Studebakers, Stars, or Chevrolets or Oaklands at Regina Chevrolet sales. In the late 1920s, the number of car dealerships in Regina totaled 16. Today, there are 17. As well as the dealerships to sell vehicles, there were spin-off industries. There were tire stores, repair shops, and gas stations. As Regina historian Bill Brennan says in his book, Regina, An Illustrated History, the automobile broadened the base of Regina's economy and enhanced its role as a distribution center. So, that's a brief look at Regina and Saskatchewan during the Roaring '20s. Now I want to tell you about one of the 40,000 residents of Regina in the late 1920s. James Henry Dillon was born in Ireland in 1893. When he was a teenager, he and his brother emigrated to Minnesota, where they worked in their uncle's hat factory. Jimmy Dillon later moved to Canada and settled in Regina, where he landed a job at Spears Funeral Chapel looking after the vehicles. He liked all things mechanical, especially automobiles. When war broke out, Dillon signed up and joined the Royal Canadian Naval Reserve. He was in Halifax, Nova Scotia in December 1917 when a Norwegian ship collided with a French cargo ship loaded with explosives. The Halifax explosion was the largest man-made explosion at the time. It left 2,000 people dead and another 9,000 injured. As well, more than 10,000 buildings were destroyed or badly damaged. Jimmy Dillon ended up with a scar from ear to ear on his chin. After the war, Dillon was given a homestead near Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. But Jimmy Dillon didn't like being a farmer. So he soon moved back to Regina and got a job as a mechanic at the Ambrose Thompson Garage. Jimmy Dillon was in Regina during the city's boom times in the Roaring '20s. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased that joining us tonight right here is that time traveler, Jimmy Dillon. So let's welcome this time traveler. Hello, Jimmy. Now, you lived in Regina during the 1920s when there was a real boom town, like 1927, the Hotel Saskatchewan was built. You saw that go up. 1928, new airport was built. Regina has passenger and mail service by air. So you've really seen this city really boom. Speaking about booming, you should see the housing that's going up around this city. Why, there's whole neighborhoods being built up by the legislature. And if you go down east, you're going to find there's buildings going in all over. There's houses around Winnipeg Street and all the way up on 4th Avenue. But I'll tell you what the biggest news is. June, General Motors announced that they were opening an assembly plant right here in Regina. It's going to be huge. Why, we're going to be making cars for all across Western Canada. Why, just the other day, I read the Morning Leader and it said that there was over 50 factories and warehouses in the city, and that the building permits have exceeded those that happened after the 1912 cyclone. And that was a time when the city was being rebuilt. Well, I'll tell you, things are really booming. So it sounds like you're pretty settled in this boom town.
Oh, I'm settled and I'm getting more settled. Why, I'm 35 years old and it's about time. The big news for me is I'm getting married in November 12th, 28. Well, congratulations. Tell us more about the bride to be. Her name is Edith Mildred Boyd. Everybody calls her Mildred. Why, she's from Duval, a pretty little town 55 miles straight north of here. Her father runs the general store and her mother's a seamstress. Would you like to meet Mildred? Oh, yeah, that'd be great. So please join me in welcoming another time traveler, Mildred Boyd. So Mildred, congratulations. We've just heard the good news that you're marrying this fine young man next month.
Yes, that's right. Once we're married, I'm going to give up my position as a school teacher so I can stay home and look after my Jimmy, my tall, handsome Irishman. You know, he asked me to marry him 3 times. And the first time he asked me, I thought, well, he was much too old. He's 13 years older than I am, you know. And then a while later, he asked me again, but I said no again.
So you said no twice?
That's right. You know, I think some girls, they get married too young, but not me. I thought I really wanted to do things like teach. And like I even went up in an airplane ride not that long ago.
Oh, yeah.
It was so amazing to fly like the birds. And not many people have gotten to do that. Some people don't even believe I have, but it's true. A woman that I work with at the school, a teacher, her brother, he has an airplane, and he took me to Moose Jaw one day. And another time, we went to Saskatoon. Anyways, I'm getting carried away with my traveling stories. You asked me about my wedding. Such a special day for any gal. Well, the third time that Jimmy asked me to marry him, I figured I'd better say yes before I became an old spinster school teacher. Jimmy's got a great job. He can fix nearly any car. And you know, he just put a down payment on a nice little house in the new area of Regina over on 4th Avenue in Argyle. And you know, I think one day he'll make a wonderful father. We're so lucky to be in love and to live in Regina in the 1920s.
Well, thank you, Mildred. Thank you, Jimmy. And thank you for traveling through time to share with us what Regina was like during the boom times of the 1920s. Bye now. The GM facility Jimmy talked about is still standing today at the corner of Winnipeg Street and 8th Avenue. When it was built in 1928, the Regina office building was strikingly similar to the one that had been built in Oshawa just a year earlier in 1927. GM spent months considering various locations for a plant in Western Canada. The idea wasn't entirely new in the auto industry. In the teens, Ford had built assembly plants in Winnipeg and Vancouver. It was front page news on June 1st, 1928, when GM announced it was building a new $1 million plant in Regina. It was the largest factory in the city with 330,000 square feet, or about 30,000 square meters. GM selected Regina for several reasons. The central location meant that Regina-made cars could be shipped to the 4 Western provinces under the slogan, Western Made for Western Trade. Another reason for choosing Regina? Sales of GM products were higher in Saskatchewan than other parts of Canada. A third reason was a source of labor, specifically farmers idle during the winter. GM bought 38 acres of land from the city of Regina at $1,000 per acre. The Morning Leader newspaper reported,
"It was a big day. Regina had secured its first big industrial plant. And it was big news. Biggest news since the war," declared one alderman. "Biggest since the cyclone," exclaimed another. And it was big news, the most constructive announcement made in years.
GM President Sam McLaughlin made the train trip from Oshawa to Regina to finalize the deal with city officials. McLaughlin told the newspaper he was optimistic about the prospects for future growth in Western Canada. He said GM was demonstrating that optimism in
The very practical form of a decision to spend $1 million on this Regina plant in anticipation of an ever-increasing market throughout the West for Canadian-built automobiles.
Then there was a ceremony where McLaughlin turned the sod for the start of the work on the plant. The morning leader reported,
Mr. McLaughlin was handed a spade and, with a vigorous push of his foot, sent the implement deep into the earth, turning over quite a generous amount. After chatting a few moments, the party entered their cars and drove to the train depot.
construction work lasted throughout the summer of 1928. There were jobs for hundreds of people. Many of the senior staff were transferred from Oshawa to Regina. The new plant officially opened on Tuesday, December 11, 1928, with a target of producing 30,000 vehicles every year. There were jobs for 850 people. At the time, Regina had a population of 40,000. With a population today of more than 200,000, the impact would be like a new plant today with about 4,500 jobs. Welcome, General Motors is the title of a 24-page supplement to the Morning Leader on December 11, 1928. The section opens by calling the GM plant
the most important announcement for Reginans since the war. The announcement meant a giant industry for Regina. It meant the employment of 850 workers. It meant the coming of other industries and other workers. Since that time, a dozen new industries have located in Regina. The year has been one of unusual importance to Regina, and the important development hinges on the coming of General Motors.
The section includes articles about the construction of the plant, how the cars will be assembled, and the state of the auto industry in Canada. There's also mention that Saskatchewan has more than 115,000 vehicles, and about 7,000 new cars were being added to Saskatchewan roads each year. That means about 20 cars were sold every day in Saskatchewan. The late 20s were indeed booming and prosperous times in Saskatchewan. With production getting underway, there were lots of new jobs for people in Regina. Sam McLaughlin returned to Regina for the official opening in December of 28. He drove the first car off the assembly line, which was powered by the first six-cylinder Chevrolet engine manufactured in Canada at GM's plant in Windsor. Later in the day, at the new Hotel Saskatchewan, after a parade through downtown, there was a civic reception. The public was invited to come and meet Sam McLaughlin and other GM officials. An editorial entitled Motor Car Headquarters of the West proclaimed that Regina now becomes the Oshawa of the West. The newspaper also said,
the coming of the General Motors plant has already worked something of a transformation in the city's life. It has quickened trade and industry generally. It has quickened the community's whole life. There's a new spirit in the air, a note of buoyancy and optimism on a scale greater than before.
Sam McLaughlin told the Morning Leader the plant demonstrated the optimism GM had in the healthy financial condition of the West, and added,
although the plant is located in Regina, we feel it will benefit the West as a whole, particularly in turning the eyes of Eastern manufacturers towards the industrial possibilities of the West, as well as the distribution of hundreds of thousands of dollars in wages and in better service to the purchaser of cars.
In a full-page ad by General Motors of Canada, the automaker said, head offices and factories, Oshawa, Ontario. Factories at Regina and Walkerville. The ad also said, Regina has become Western Canada's Motor City. The Regina-made vehicles were different in some ways from those made in Oshawa. For example, Regina-made 1929 Chevrolets had spoked wheels, while the Oshawa versions had solid wheels. The GM plant had a tremendous ripple effect on the Regina economy. Related businesses built factories near the GM plant to make glass, paint, and batteries. As well, houses and apartments were built for workers. Business people opened new shops and restaurants near the GM plant. GM built a posh new dealership in downtown Regina to show off its new products. That red brick building is still standing and now is used for offices. Al Ritchie was the coach of the Regina Pats when the team won the Memorial Cup as junior hockey champions of Canada in the spring of 1930. The city of Regina honored Ritchie by presenting him with a new Chevrolet,
one that was manufactured in Regina and purchased from Regina Chevrolet sales. So the GM plant capped off a tremendous decade of growth in Regina, but the good times didn't last long. The boom soon went bust. When the stock market crashed in October 1929, the Regina plant had been open for less than a year. Then came the drought, devastating the crops in Saskatchewan. No province was hit harder than Saskatchewan. Automobile sales dropped off, and with the economy in shambles, GM laid off some workers in early 1930. By August 1930, production was halted. In March 31, the plant was reopened, but was shut down again a few months later. As well as the assembly line employees out of work, so too were people in related industries and neighboring stores and restaurants. In 1937, with the economy gradually showing some signs of improving, GM announced it would be reopening its Regina plant. However, the plant needed extensive refurbishing. Production methods had changed dramatically. GM spent about $700,000 getting the plant ready to run again. Some of the executives who had been in Regina when the plant first opened in 1928 and then went back to Oshawa when it closed returned to Regina when the plant reopened in 1937. For the assembly line workers, priority was given to those who had been working at the plant when it closed in 1931. Harry Carmichael, GM's vice president, took the train from Oshawa to Regina for the grand reopening ceremony in January 1938. In his address at a community reception at the Hotel Saskatchewan, Carmichael talked about the importance of corporate Canada helping out those areas hardest hit by the Depression.
Our company, in spending over $700,000 in rehabilitating and reopening our Regina operations, is not guided by the necessity for production facilities, but by a belief, right or wrong, that it is in the economic national welfare that we extend a helping hand to the Western provinces in their greatest time of need.
Public tours of the refurbished plant were held. An estimated 6,500 people turned out to tour the facility and see how cars were made. The reopening also meant jobs for 400 people, but that was less than half the number of jobs there had been when the plant first opened. One of the people who landed a job at the GM plant when it reopened in 1938 was Jimmy Dillon. To find out more what that plant was like then, let's welcome back that time traveler, Jimmy Dillon. Hey, Jimmy, do you remember this picture of you working on the GM assembly line?
Oh, yeah. I remember one of the guys came to work with his brand new Kodak Brownie and snapped a few pictures. I guess I should have turned around on the picture for a smile. But I'll tell you what, we're sure glad to be working in this plant. I'm glad to be there. I'm very lucky, actually. You know, when the GM plant reopened, they had a company policy that former employees were hired first. And then it was married men who were on assistance, and I never was on assistance. Then it was single men on assistance. And then finally, they opened it for the general public, and I got hired. Now, I'm sure glad I did.
Well, yeah, Jimmy, a lot of people didn't have any work during the Depression. So how did you make out before this job at the GM plant?
Well, it was really bad. Never imagined life could have been that tough. Our little daughter, Elsie, was born in 1931. And you know what? Our family was luckier than most. We had a family together. We had a house that we were just able to keep by renting out the basement. And you know, I always managed to find a little bit of work. But it was tough.
But you had lots of experience as an auto mechanic.
That's right. I worked for Thompson Garage for 10 years. But you know what? They had to get rid of us in 1930. There was no money to fix cars. There was no money for gas for a lot of people. A lot of people just parked their cars. Or you know what some did? They took the engines out of the cars and they hitched up horses and they used the cars that way. They called them Bennett buggies. You know, our Prime Minister, Bennett in Ottawa, I don't think he realized how tough we were having it out here out west. So I think some people felt we were a bit abandoned.
So what did you do when you lost your job then?
Well, a couple of buddies of mine started the Ray Street garage. At first, it wasn't too bad, but you know what? Money started getting short, and there just wasn't enough for 3 families, so we had to close her down.
So then, did you get another job?
Well, I knew a guy at the Travelers Garage up on Albert and Vic, but you know what? He shut after a year.
Wow. So what happened then?
Well, you know what? I needed money to put food on the table, and there was a job rum running. Yeah, you drive down to Moose Jaw and pick up rum and then drive it down to Chicago. I'll tell you, I made some pretty good money there, but Prohibition ended, and that was in 1931 in the United States, and well, that was the end of that.
So I see now why you were so glad to land that job at the GM plant.
Well, I got a job at Regina Auto Body on Angus, but they ran into some problems and they had to get rid of me. And the next year, I went over to Honer Auto Body at Albert and Vic. I was glad for the work, but each job paid a little bit less. I was actually down to $4 a week. Well, you can barely keep a family fed on that.
Well, I see now why you were so glad to land this job at the GM plant.
The best part, I'm earning $24.20 a week.
Wow, and I understand that's a huge change. I understand that's because of the union, the United Auto Workers. They had a sit-down strike in Flint, and then that really changed the auto industry where most people were unionized, and those new contracts also covered workers in the Canadian plants in Oshawa and Windsor and right here in Regina.
And I'll tell you what, we're building new Buicks, Chevs, Olds, Pontiacs. We're also doing trucks, Chev and Maple Leaf trucks right here. You know, I didn't like much working at my uncle's hat factory in Minnesota, but things are different now. I've got a family, I'm making money, and instead of hats, I'm making cars. Hey, I got to get to work.
Okay, well, Jimmy, thanks for joining us and telling us what the GM plant was like in the 30s. When the GM plant reopened, the Leader Post newspaper said,
located in the center of the populated area of the Prairie West, Regina is ideally situated as a distribution point for the products of General Motors. Western points, which had formerly had to wait for shipment of new model cars from the Oshawa plant, will now receive them with less delay, with delivery from Regina.
As the jobs returned, things were looking good. Life was getting better in Regina in the late 1930s. Certainly not as good as the 1920s, but far better than the early 30s. But everything was about to change. With the outbreak of the Second World War, Canadians went overseas to fight. And back at home, there were war bond drives. The GM plant in Regina was converted to a munitions factory in the early 1940s. It became the largest munitions plant in Saskatchewan, employing almost 1,600 men and women. So, how did Jimmy Dillon and his family make out during the Second World War? Well, Jimmy didn't serve in the military this time because he was now in his late 40s. He had already left GM when it was converted into a munitions plant. Dillon had landed a job as a mechanic, servicing grain elevators with Saskatchewan Pool Elevators, the forerunner of Viterra. That's when real job stability began. The Dillon family added a son, Jim, in 1940. And the family moved into a larger home in 1956 on Elphinstone Street. Dillon stayed at the Wheat Pool for almost 20 years. He retired in 1958. Now, to catch up on what's been happening, let's welcome back a time traveler from several decades ago, Mildred Dillon. By the way, Jimmy Dillon heart attack at the age of 69 in 1962. Hello, Mildred.
That was a long time ago, more than 40 years ago, since my Jimmy died. He died in the summer of 62. That was when the doctors were on strike. How could the doctors be on strike? My Jimmy liked working at the wheat pool. He'd drive around southern Saskatchewan fixing grain elevators. It was about that time that we had our second child, Jim, in 1940. Elsie was 9 then. She was such a wonderful big sister. I'm so thankful for my tall, handsome Irishman and my 2 lovely children.
And Mildred, tell us about your kids. First, your daughter, the eldest, Elsie.
Elsie married and moved to BC just after her dad died. She had 2 children, Patricia and Chuck. They're the only 2 grandchildren I have. I love my grandchildren. They're so special. My granddaughter, Patricia, worked in that big Cornwall center in the 1980s. And when she'd get to talking with her customers, they'd tell her how they knew her grandpa. And they would say, Grandpa fixed my car. But you know, Grandpa might have even built their car. My Jimmy.
And how about your son, Jim?
Jim went to university in Vancouver. He got a law degree. He worked all over. He worked in Vancouver, Ottawa, and Calgary. He even worked in the Middle East. That's where he met that nice Noella. And they got married.
And what are they up to these days?
Well, Jim is retired with Noella in Australia.
Ah, well, thank you very much for sharing those stories with us, Mildred. By the way, Mildred Dillon died at the age of 96 in 2003. After the war ended and the return to peace was celebrated, a lot of people in Saskatchewan were hoping that GM would reopen the plant. They wanted Regina to again be Western Canada's motor city and turn out Buicks, Chevrolets, Oldsmobiles, and Pontiacs, as well as Chevrolet and Maple Leaf trucks for all of Western Canada. But it never happened. Automobile production techniques and distribution methods had changed dramatically from the time the plant opened in 1928. It simply no longer made sense to build vehicles in Regina for the 4 western provinces. The government offered the plant back to GM, but the automaker turned down the offer. It was then used as a supply depot for the Department of National Defense. Later, it was taken over by the provincial government and subdivided into a number of businesses. Later, the city of Regina owned it. The factory portion now is vacant, while the office building is still home to many small businesses. Regina's big dreams of becoming Oshawa West came crashing down when the Depression hit and then ended for good after the Second World War. At the Canadian Automotive Museum in Oshawa, the Regina GM plant is part of a display about the historical significance of the city of Regina in the Canadian automotive industry. There's even a Regina-made Chevrolet on display. The office building that was once home to GM in Regina is still standing and now is home to a variety of businesses and organizations. One can only imagine what might have been if there wasn't the Great Depression, if there hadn't been the Second World War. Regina might still be known as Western Canada's Motor City. I'd like to thank many people and organizations for helping with this presentation. I'd like to make a special thank you to Jimmy and Mildred Dillon's granddaughter, Pat Newson of Vancouver, and Jimmy and Mildred's son, Jim of Brisbane, Australia. Pat and Jim provided many of the stories, details, and images presented, and this story would not have been possible without Pat and Jim.
Thank you so much, Dale. Yeah, we had some more comments about how interesting the presentation was, and thank you for your time. I hope everybody has a great summer, and thank you.